Yet another scheduling coincidence. I'm on a roll here. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone. I wasn't planning on making a video specifically for this day, but the latest winner of the Patreon vote just so happened to be a topic that kinda sorta fits with the theme of romance. Guess that's what they call a happy accident. I do enjoy some romance in stories from time to time, and one of my favorite romances in fiction is that of Scott and Ramona from the Scott Pilgrim series. Now, in most conversations I've had, when the topic of Scott Pilgrim comes up, people think about the movie adaptation. In fact, some don't even know that the movie was an adaptation. If you're familiar with the original source material, you'll know that the film, like most movie recreations, has some differences, not just with the plot, but how its main romance and the character relationships in general are portrayed. And today I'm going to be delving into what those differences are and whether or not they keep the movie from being a worthy adaptation. But before we get into that, I should answer a question that I'm sure some of you are wondering. What the hell is Scott Pilgrim? Well, the Scott Pilgrim story was originally a series of graphic novels written and drawn by Brian Lee O'Malley. It follows the titular character Scott as he falls for a delivery girl named Ramona Flowers. The two seem to hit it off, but there's one thing standing in the way of them having a happy relationship. Actually, make that 7 things. Throughout the series, Scott is challenged by Ramona's 7 evil exes, led by her most recent ex, Gideon. And as Scott works his way up the chain, he's also confronted by problems in his own life, including some of his own past relationships. The series spanned over 6 graphic novels published from 2004 to 2010 in black and white, then re-released in hardcover and in color from 2012 to 2014. On the same year that the last volume was originally published, Universal released a film adaptation directed by Edgar Wright. The movie does stay relatively faithful to the first 2 books and some of the third, with some scenes being adapted line for line and shot for shot. But from that point onward, the movie goes its own way. In fact, because the movie was being written around the same time as the final book in the series, the final fight is very different between the 2 incarnations, and the movie almost had a completely different ending. Now, the first major difference is that because the film only had about 90 minutes to tell the story of 6 books, the supporting cast doesn't get as much development. The movie didn't have the luxury of being stretched out across multiple entries, so instead of occasionally looking at the supporting characters' lives and how they tie back into the main romance, the story focuses solely on Scott and Ramona, and that affects the plot on more than just a superficial level. You see, one of the main themes, if not the main theme of the Scott Pilgrim series, is relationships. Not just the ones we have in the present, but also the ones we had in the past and how they affect the way we approach future relationships, as well as our general outlook on relationships as a whole. 3 of the supporting characters, Kim, Envy, and Knives, were ex-girlfriends that Scott had at different points in his life, and they have a big influence on his behavior in the series, but because the film had to cut out the major details, especially with Kim, the theme of relationships loses most of its resonance in that version. The next major difference lies in how both incarnations portray Scott and Ramona's dynamic with each other. In the books, Ramona decides to go out with Scott because she was throwing him a bone, but over time she develops genuine feelings for him and begins to care about his well-being. She even reaches a point where she feels that she's holding Scott back because of how many failed relationships she's had. While she initially comes off as stoic and collected, we gradually learn that she can be just as dorky as Scott and just as emotionally fragile, if not more so. What starts off as a one-sided crush develops into a partnership where both parties better each other. In the movie, their relationship starts out the same way, but it keeps that initial feeling of one-sidedness throughout the film. The first impression that we get of Ramona becomes a true assumption instead of a misconception. Don't get me wrong, she still has a personality, and she's still one of the stronger characters in the movie, but when I look at her relationship with Scott in this version, it comes off as though she doesn't really reciprocate his feelings for her for most of the story. Up until the very last scene, it feels that instead of growing to love him, she just settles for him because she can't do any worse than her past exes, and it's because of the comparative shallowness of their relationship that some viewers prefer the movie's alternate ending. I watched the movie before I read the books, and I still felt that something was missing from Scott and Ramona's dynamic. And when I read the books, I immediately preferred their portrayal of the two over the movies. The books show that Scott and Ramona are almost different versions of each other. Both of them have struggled with significant others in the past, but they each have their own ways of dealing with it. Ramona constantly tries to run away from her problems, often bailing when things get too difficult for her. But Scott prefers to pretend that those problems never even happened, and ends up repeating the same mistakes because of that. When they get together, they realize how flawed they really are, and they motivate each other to better better themselves. Now, with all that being said, do I think that the film is a bad adaptation? No. Like I said, the film had time constraints, and things had to be cut for the sake of telling a cohesive story, and it succeeds in that regard. Changes had to be made to fit the medium. That's where the adapt and adaptation comes from. While the movie is a more straightforward, condensed retelling of the books, it still has plenty of merits. The score is on point with the hipster-esque, video game-inspired style of the books. The fight scenes are beautiful and well choreographed, and Edgar Wright's quick-cut directing style was a perfect fit for the story. The actors not only resemble most of the characters really well, but their performances are great too. Captain America as Lucas and 2006 Superman as Todd? Gold. There are even parts of the film that I prefer over the books. I like how the fight with Lucas is more fleshed out in the film, and some of the jokes that the movie adds in are really funny. I would still recommend it to anyone that's interested in the story. The books are still the way to go when it comes to characterization and character development, but that's not to say that the movie isn't a worthwhile flick. If you can, try both versions out and see which one you prefer, and whether you're single, dating, married, or fighting a league of evil exes, I hope you all have a happy Valentine's Day. So what do you think of the Scott Pilgrim series? Do you prefer the books or the movie? Swarm that comment section below or bug me on social media, and consider supporting me through Patreon or PayPal or commissions. Until next time, keep it sketchy, folks.